Okay, let's unpack this. When we talk about the Glagolitic script, the one created by Saint Cyril and Methodius, the story usually kind of stops there. It's presented as this great achievement in Great Moravia. But if we really dig into the sources you've brought, the truly incredible story, the real legacy, it all starts right after that mission completely fell apart.
Exactly. And what's so fascinating here is that the creation of Glagolitic was this huge political statement. It was a direct challenge to the Germanic influence in Central Europe. And that challenge failed. I mean, it failed spectacularly.
Right.
The moment of its biggest crisis, which was the expulsion of all of Cyril and Methodius' students from Great Moravia in 886, that was ironically the real start of its journey. It wasn't some grand plan. It was a forced diaspora.
Yes, that's such a key point. The source material shows a script that was, for all intents and purposes, banned. Its followers were purged. This wasn't just some vague political chaos. It was a very targeted action. It was driven by Prince Svetopluk and the Latin-speaking German clergy who saw this whole Slavic liturgy thing as a threat to their power.
Dangerous novelty,
Okay.
precisely. So they kick out these highly trained, devoted scholars, people like Clement and Neonium, and just like that, the Moravian mission is shut down. But here's the thing. Instead of just dying out, the students carried this flame and they head east and they head west, and they end up ensuring that Glagolitic survives in two totally different worlds.
The Byzantine East and the Roman West.
Exactly.
So our mission today is to trace that forced migration. How did Glagolitic go from being this persecuted script to finding these two very different sanctuaries? And then how is it that this ancient script is still showing up on, modern coins and even in video games? Let's start with that first path to safety, the move eastward into the First Bulgarian Empire.
Right. The eastern route was the path to stability, to institutionalization, and just a massive amount of literary activity. So you have scholars like Clement of Ohrid and St. Nadium. They head south and east, straight to the court of Tsar Boris I in Bulgaria.
And this is where the politics get really interesting. Why would Tsar Boris I, a ruler who is walking this incredibly delicate line between Rome and Byzantium, decide to just welcome these scholars and their script with open arms?
That is the crucial question, isn't it? Boris had just converted Bulgaria, and he desperately needed a strong, unifying cultural identity, one that was separate from the Latin sphere, but also, at least at first, separate from the dominant Greek-Byzantine world.
So Glagolitic was the perfect tool.
The perfect vehicle. By taking in the expelled scholars, he instantly got a ready-made, highly educated clergy who could teach and run the church in a language his people actually understood. It rooted the new faith deeply.
That one decision completely changed the script's destiny. It went from being this sort of fragile missionary project in Moravia to a core pillar of the Bulgarian state.
And that state support immediately led to the founding of the two most important centers for early Slavic literacy: the Preslav Literary School near the capital, and the Ohrid Literary School out in the west with Clement in charge.
So how are these two schools different? Were they just doing the same thing?
Not exactly, and their different roles really point to a very sophisticated state plan.
Oh, interesting.
Preslav was more about translation, standardization, refining the texts. It was the hub for what we call the golden age of Bulgarian literature. Ohrid, on the other hand, under Clement, was basically a massive teacher training college. Clement is said to have personally trained thousands of priests and teachers.
So Preslav was about the text and Ohrid was about the transmission.
You've got it. That distinction is key. It meant Glagolitic wasn't just surviving, it was actively spreading and becoming standardized.
And you can see that reverence for the script in the actual literature they were producing.
Oh, absolutely. You just have to look at the work of Constantine of Preslav. He was one of the most brilliant writers there, later became a bishop. He wrote a work called the Alphabetic Prayer, and in it, he uses this incredible acrostation that shows this deep, deep respect for the Glagolitic script itself.
An acrostation, so where the first letter of each line spells something out. How did that affirm the script? Was it just a clever trick?
It was so much more than a trick. It was a profound act of validation. In his poem, the first letter of each line, read down, spells out the entire Glagolitic alphabet in order.
Wow.
So he wasn't just writing with the script, he was celebrating the script as a divine gift. He was literally embedding the alphabet into the act of prayer, cementing its sacred status in the Bulgarian church.
That really does wrap up the Eastern story perfectly. It finds this immediate institutional home, although, ironically, its success there eventually led to it being replaced by the Cyrillic script, which was just easier to write.
A necessary evolution, you could say.
Yeah.
But Glagolitic was the foundation. Now, if we turn and look west, it is a completely different story.
Right.
The students who went towards the Adriatic coast into what's now Croatia, they faced a landscape dominated by the Holy Roman Empire and, crucially, by the papacy.
So, no grand state welcome in the West. It had to find a much smaller, more local niche. And it did that by actually changing its appearance, didn't it? The sources talk about the squared variant.
Yes, exactly. The script that journeyed west evolved into what's known as Croatian, or squared Glagolitic.
Yeah.
Visually, it's much more geometric, more rigid than the round script they used in the east. This might be partly because it was being carved into stone, like on the famous Bashika tablet. Straight lines are just easier to carve.
And that unique look helped reinforce its unique cultural place.
It did. But here's where it gets really interesting. By the 12th century, the original round Glagolitic is pretty much gone everywhere else, replaced by Cyrillic. But in Croatia, the squared version doesn't just survive. It gets this unique formal protection that secures its use for centuries.
So you're talking about 1248, Pope Innocent V.
That is the inflection point. Innocent V grants the Croatians in southern Dalmatia this exclusive, extraordinary privilege to use their own Slavic language and the Glagolitic script in the Roman Rite liturgy.
Okay, hold on. Why would the Pope do that? I mean, the papacy was pushing Latin as the universal language everywhere else in Western Europe. Why make this radical, unprecedented exception for the Dalmatian coast? What was in it for Rome?
It was pure strategic politics. You have to connect it to the bigger picture of the great schism between the Eastern and Western churches. Croatia was right on that volatile border between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East. By granting this rare privilege, the Pope did two things. First, he cemented the loyalty of the Croatians to Rome by respecting their traditions. And second,
He created a buffer zone.
exactly, a strong, organized Catholic population that was culturally distinct from the Orthodox Slavs around them, precisely because Rome had sanctioned their unique local practices.
So it wasn't some act of liberal tolerance. It was a high-level diplomatic play to maintain control.
Absolutely. And this permission, it was formally given to the Bishop of Senj, but it spread all along the Adriatic coast. To show how serious they were, the Holy See itself later started publishing Glagolitic missals in Rome.
So it became a living, papally sanctioned script.
And that's what ensured it was used in church for centuries, long after its original purpose was gone.
It's just such a perfect dichotomy. In the East, it's institutionalized and then evolves into Cyrillic. In the West, it's this localized, exceptional survivor kept alive by a papal decree for over 700 years.
And its endurance was just phenomenal. Even when the Latin script eventually started to replace the Glagolitic letters in the missals themselves, just because it was easier to print, the most important part of that legacy continued.
Which was the use of the Slavic language in the Mass itself.
Right. The authorization to use the vernacular. And that precedent, that idea later spread. The sources note that the authorization was extended to some other Slavic regions much later, between 1886 and 1935, building on that original Croatian case.
Which raises a really important question. How does an ancient liturgical script, one that basically survived because of a very specific papal decree, stay relevant in the 21st century? You'd think it would just be something for academics.
You would think so, but it's showing up in some really surprising places, especially as a marker of national identity and even in the digital world.
It's kind of everywhere now, if you know where to look.
It is. The most visible example is probably on Croatia's own money. If you look at the Croatian national sides of their euro and cent coins, which were presented in 2022, there are Glagolitic letters worked right into the design. It's literally stamped into the country's economy.
From stone tablets in the 11th century to pocket change in the European Union, that's quite a journey.
But its history has other strange twists. For instance, because the script looks so unusual to outsiders, it was sometimes used for cryptography.
Wait, for secret codes?
Yeah. There are records of Glagolitic being used as a kind of runic encryption in the Cyrillic world. It was a known script, but just unfamiliar enough to be a decent code.
That's a fantastic detail. The script made for spreading the word was also used for keeping secrets.
It's a great irony. And today, it's fully integrated into digital culture. It's not just stuck in museums. You see it in video games, like Ouijaman 3, Zikigan, where it's used to represent ancient or runic text. And there are even educational projects, like a Glagolitic Tetris game designed to teach the script. But most importantly, it was officially added to the Unicode standard in 2005.
Which means it has a permanent, searchable place in the digital world.
Forever.
So what does this all mean then? Glagolitic's entire legacy is a story of diaspora. It starts with this hopeful but politically fragile mission in Great Moravia. When that gets shut down, the scattered students carry it away, and it survives through two completely different political mechanisms.
In the east, the Bulgarian Empire gave it safety, which allowed it to grow and evolve into Cyrillic. And in the west, along the Croatian coast, it survived through this unique, high-level church diplomacy, that papal exception from 1248, which let it live on as a liturgical script against all odds.
It's such a powerful example of how political necessity can actually drive cultural preservation. A script made to unify one region survived only because of these totally different external political forces.
Which leaves you with a final thought to mull over.
Go on.
If the students had been allowed to stay in Great Moravia, if their mission had succeeded peacefully, would the script have even survived? Or would it have been too centralized, too vulnerable to the next political shift? How often is it that political adversity, that forced scattering, is the real reason a culture survives in unexpected ways, rather than, some peaceful, well-laid plan?
Yeah.
It makes you think about how fragile, or maybe how resilient, these cultural artifacts really are.